Charleston, South Carolina, autumn 1987. The air along the Battery carries the weight of salt, memory, and time. Live oaks arch over the sidewalks like protectors of secrets, their branches draped in Spanish moss that dances with every breeze coming off the harbor. It is Thursday morning, just after 8, and Evelyn Carter walks her usual route, through Church Street's cobblestone hush, past the brick walls of the old Exchange, where history clings to every corner. She wears a navy blue cardigan, her silver hair tied into a low bun, and carries a worn leather satchel pressed against her side like something sacred. She walks here every week, to the same small park near the French Huguenot church. There, between two benches beneath a tulip poplar, she sits quietly and remembers. She has written James Miller a letter every Thursday for 43 years. In May of 1944, James, her fiancé and high school sweetheart, had boarded a troop ship bound for Normandy as part of the 29th Infantry Division. Before leaving, he carved her a small wooden box from Georgia pine, simple, smoothed by hand, with a brass clasp. And inside it he placed a photo of them laughing under a magnolia tree, a pressed dogwood blossom, and a note that read, "Don't let silence win. Write." He never wrote back. In late 1945, Evelyn received a telegram from the War Department. James had been declared missing in action during the breakout from Saint-Lô, presumed dead. She grieved quietly. Her parents never spoke of him again, but something inside her resisted the finality of the message. That winter, she wrote him a letter. She didn't expect it to go anywhere. She just needed to write. She mailed it anyway. And then, every Thursday after that, she wrote again. At first, out of hope, then out of ritual, then because it was the only way she knew how to carry him with her into the decades that followed. She sent her letters to Red Cross, forwarding addresses, to Army records offices, even to chaplains' ministries in France and Belgium. Some came back unopened, most vanished. But she kept writing. And on this Thursday morning, grey skies, the air thick with quiet, Evelyn turns the corner into the garden square and sees someone sitting on the bench she always thought of as hers. An elderly man. He's alone, slender, stooped, wearing a wool coat despite the humid chill. In his hands, a stack of old letters, pages yellowed with age. One flutters as he adjusts it in the breeze. Evelyn's chest tightens, because even from 10 feet away, she recognizes the handwriting. Her handwriting. She freezes. Her breath falters. The past, she thought, buried blooms at once in her chest, as real as the bricks beneath her feet. And when he lifts his eyes to hers, sea blue rimmed with memory, she knows it's him. If this story touched you the way it touched me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us continue telling stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. And now, prepare yourself, because what happens next changes everything. In the spring of 1944, Charleston breathed in both the sweetness of magnolia blossoms and the slow ache of departure, a city suspended between quiet southern beauty and the distant roar of a world at war. Along the narrow brick alleys and under wrought-iron balconies draped with ivy, life carried on with the subdued resilience of people who had grown used to ration books, telegrams, and faces disappearing from porches without knowing if they would ever return. Evelyn Carter, just shy of 21, was one of those young women who carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity, the kind that made her seem older than she was, though her heart had never felt more fragile than in those final days of spring. Her fiancé, James Miller, a soft-spoken carpenter's apprentice with gentle hands and sharp blue eyes, had been drafted into the U.S. Army and assigned to the 29th Infantry Division. His orders were clear. In less than a week, he would board a train at Union Station and be shipped off to Europe to fight in a war that neither of them fully understood, but that both of them knew could steal everything they had not yet lived. They met one last time beneath the sycamore tree behind Evelyn's family's home, the very tree where he'd asked her to marry him, not with a ring, but with a folded piece of paper that read, "If I come back, will you still be here?" She had answered him then with a smile and a nod, too full of emotion to find the words, and now, with his departure drawing near, he pressed a small wooden box into her hands. A simple thing he had carved himself, its corners worn smooth, its clasp slightly loose, but inside it lay a black and white photo of the two of them taken on a picnic by the Cooper River, a dried magnolia petal still whole. Ding faint traces of its scent, and a note barely longer than a breath that said, "No matter what happens, write to me. Don't let silence have the last word." That was the only promise they made. Not that he would come back, not that she would wait forever, but that there would be words between them, even when distance and war made everything else uncertain. The day he left, the station was crowded with families doing their best to be brave. Mothers clutching handkerchiefs, younger brothers pretending not to cry, and lovers holding one another as if they could imprint the shape of their bodies into memory. Evelyn wore a navy coat that belonged to her sister and kept her hands clasped tightly around James's fingers until the final boarding call. They didn't kiss goodbye. Somehow it felt too final. But he turned to her one last time before climbing onto the train and said, "Every Thursday, I'll be listening." That night, alone in her room with the box beside her and the silence already growing too loud, Evelyn wrote the first letter. On pale blue stationery, in her neat looping hand, she told him about the dinner she had made with his mother, the small incident with the neighbor's cat, the way the sky over the river had looked like watercolor just before dusk. Small things, perhaps, but they felt like everything. She folded the letter, sealed the envelope, and addressed it to a military post office number she hoped was still active, and when she dropped it in the box the next morning, she whispered to no one, "One down, however many it takes to bring him home." Weeks passed, then months. News from the front came in patches, reports of the D-Day landings, advances through hedgerows, lists of the missing and the dead printed in the local paper with too little ceremony. Still, Evelyn wrote, each Thursday became its own ritual. Wake early, make tea, sit by the window overlooking the garden, and put pen to paper as if he were still reading every word. But on October 17th, 1944, a telegram arrived. The knock on the door was loud, the courier young, the envelope thin. The message inside was simple, cold, and final. Private James Miller, missing in action, presumed captured or deceased, St. Lo. There was no body, no further detail, no map to follow, just silence. Her mother folded her hands in prayer and said it was time to let go. Her friends brought flowers. Her sister offered her room for the weekend, but Evelyn said nothing. That Thursday, she sat at her desk, as always, and wrote again. "Dear James, I don't know if this will find you, but I have to believe that somewhere, somehow, you're still listening," she continued, week after week, letter after letter. The return addresses changed. First the APO, then Red Cross field offices, then international forwarding centers. Some envelopes came back marked undeliverable. Others vanished. By 1948, she had taken a job as a teacher at the local high school. Her students knew her as firm, kind, always dressed in grey. None of them knew she wrote letters every Thursday to a man they assumed had been her first heartbreak. By 1952, she had filled an entire drawer with unsent words. By 1960, she had begun making copies in case the originals were lost. She dated no one, married no one. She did not wear black. She did not grieve aloud. She simply wrote, always beginning the same way. "Dear James, today I thought of you again." And though time moved on, the letters never stopped. The world James Miller returned to was one he scarcely recognized. Europe in 1945 lay scarred, its cities half buried and drunk on shell shock, while Dresden, waiting in America, seemed frozen in a memory that no longer matched his own, as though the city's shadows and streets remembered him better than he remembered them. He was taken captive near St. Lo, wounded, exhausted, and collapsed against the dank earth before being led by strangers in olive drab into a prisoner of war transport that rattled through the French countryside, carrying him into a world of lines and numbers and nameless faces pressed silent by displacement. For months, He drifted through military camps, retrofitted into holding centers, first in northern France, then in Belgium, finally crossing the border into a liberated part of Germany where Allied soldiers passed out his paperwork before shipping him eventually to a transit camp near Frankfurt. There, dirty and hollow-eyed, he stayed in wooden bunks stacked 3 deep with rows of conditioned men where everyone was the same. Hungry, voiceless, home still far away, and no address to send their ghosts to. James counted days by the crackle of fire, by the sound of boots outside his door, until one day a tall aide offered him something he barely recognized: discharge papers and a one-way bus ticket toward the American zone, with instructions to report to an aid office in Berlin. But home was not waiting. Charleston lay 1,000 miles behind him, a different world behind a different fence. His name was not on any manifest, and the army had no records of him to send him back. The new government in Germany, fragmented and wary of returning soldiers from the old regime, made return prohibited and complicated. No, they would not let him cross. Instead, he was shuffled along like driftwood to a displaced persons camp outside of Munich in the American-controlled sector, where tents and makeshift barracks held families who used to be whole, but now numbered only in paperwork and prayer. James spent years there, without purpose but with routine. He helped cook in the mess hall by morning. Standing over vats of stew, he imagined tasting like soup back home, heard children practicing their ABCs in the background, and at dusk, he climbed a hill outside the camp to see the Alps pale in the distance, waiting to melt into something he thought might be a memory. He learned to shave again, to walk further, to smile half the time, but the other half of the time he carried the small wooden box in his jacket pocket, the box he had given Evelyn before he left, the one she kept safe beneath the sycamore. When letters finally arrived, months later through channels he'd forgotten, they came like ghost ships, drifting into the camp steadier than the ration lines. The first one was postmarked Red Cross, ink smudged and the return address barely legible, but the handwriting, looping, confident, was unmistakable. Dear James, today I thought of you. It hit him sideways in the mess hall, letters clutched in his trembling hand, as if her voice cracked across time to pull him back from erosion. He closed his eyes while the pot simmered and the camp bustled around him and pressed the letter to his chest, his breath shallow, because in that moment he realized he was not a ghost yet, because someone had written him a poem in ink, a promise. From then on, letters came intermittently, a few every month, sometimes one every other week, depending on forwarding addresses, depending on fate and bureaucracy and Evelyn's own persistence. Each envelope carried small doses of home, descriptions of azalea blooms, complaints about rain washing away the chalkboard writing in her classroom, stories about her cat toppling flower pots, or about how she still dreaded using the phone because she was convinced it would ring and fall silent. And he read each one. First he hid them, folded articles along his cot, smuggled them into a wall pocket, ran his fingers along the cursive lines as if hoping to trace the curves of her cheek or the shape of her voice. He wanted to reply, but he couldn't. He could not summon the words to say, "I am sorry for the time I stole from you," or "I waited," building walls between us that years cannot erase. He could not write that he had tried and failed, or that he had lied to himself for so long that the letters seemed like an echo from a stranger. So he kept reading, silent, collecting them without responding, a ghost learning to listen again. When the camp finally dissolved, years later, after the border began to hold, after arrangements were made for refugees to resettle, James was offered passage to resettle in the United States. He chose to go back. Charleston was distant now, but so was that boxed room by the river where everything began. He boarded a transport to the American zone, crossed the ocean in a worn uniform, watched storms at sea that reminded him of prayers, and arrived in New York, blinking at the skyline, unmoored, but tethered to a name signed in blue ink so many Thursdays ago. He rode a train south, past tobacco fields and church steeples, past small towns with painted signs reading "Welcome Home," until his train slowed and he stepped onto the platform at Union Station in Charleston. The air tasted brackish with marsh and memory. He carried the box in his coat pocket, and he carried a stack of letters wrapped in brown paper, a trove gathered from German aid offices and Red Cross volunteers, each one a tether to Evelyn's voice. But he never went home, not yet. Instead, he found a rooming house for veterans, swapped his uniform for promise, and took a job as a night watchman in a warehouse downtown where the hum of machinery filled the space where words could not reach. At night, he read her letters until his eyes lost clarity, then lay in bed, staring through the window at rooftops, and wondered if she still wrote, if she still added details like how she liked her coffee or the way the sunlight filtered through her curtains. Years settled around him like dust, but he could not write. Every Thursday he read, every Thursday she wrote. And in that mutual silence of words unreturned, they lived between hope and grief, tethered by ink and memory, until the world finally conspired to return them to the same bench under the magnolia-hung boughs. It was a Thursday morning in late October when the air in Charleston had begun to shift, as if the weather itself was shedding memory from the trees, dropping golden leaves onto the worn sidewalks like forgotten pages of a book too tender to discard. The light was different that day, gentler, more hesitant, and Evelyn Carter, now in her late 60s, moved a little slower through the familiar streets that wound through the French Quarter, her shoes clicking softly over cobblestones, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her worn leather satchel, unaware that the rhythm of her routine was about to collide with something she had once stopped be. Leaving was even possible. She took her usual turn into the garden, a quiet square tucked behind the Huguenot church where few tourists ventured, where the benches creaked with age and the scent of old camellias lingered from seasons past. It was the place she always went to write her Thursday letter, sometimes on paper, sometimes only in her head, but always with the same purpose: to remember James not as the boy she lost, but as the promise she had never let go of. But on this Thursday, someone was already sitting on the bench. At first, she hesitated. This was not a place often shared, and she considered simply turning back. The man sitting there was elderly, thin-framed beneath a long wool coat, his back slightly hunched, his hands holding what looked like a stack of aged letters. Something about the way he turned the pages made her stop. He wasn't reading casually. He was reading slowly, reverently, as though each word mattered more than the one before it. And then she saw it. The handwriting. Her handwriting. Frozen, Evelyn felt her breath leave her lungs in a slow, stunned exhale. Her eyes scanned the shape of his profile, the sharp line of the nose, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he read, the curve of his hand against the paper. And somewhere in the depths of recognition, her heart whispered a name it had not spoken aloud in decades. She took a step forward, then another. The sound of her shoes on the stone path drew his attention, and as he looked up, his eyes, pale blue, rimmed with time, but unmistakably his, met hers. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The letters trembled slightly in his lap. Evelyn felt the park fall silent around them, as if every bird, every leaf, every breath of wind had paused to bear witness to what was unfolding. Then, with the faintest crack in his voice, he said, "Evelyn." She nodded, the tears already rising, but held back by something stronger than grief, something like awe. James. He looked down at the letters in his lap, touched the top page as if to confirm it was real, and said softly, "I never stopped reading them." She moved slowly, sat beside him on the bench, close but not touching. The air between them felt full, not of explanation, not of apology, but of understanding. "Did you get them all?" He shook his head. "Not all, but enough." She smiled, the kind of smile that only comes from a lifetime of waiting. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small bundle, tied with a faded ribbon, edges worn, and set it on the bench between them. "These are the ones that came back, the ones that never found you." He looked at them, then at her, and for a long while they said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the letters hadn't already said. because time had taught them that silence could hold as much truth as words. Eventually, Evelyn stood and offered her hand. "Walk with me?" He took it. They moved slowly through the garden, down the path they both remembered, toward the old train depot at the edge of town, the place where she had once watched him disappear into war, and where, for years afterward, she had returned in dreams, always too late, always reaching. The depot had changed, but not completely. The tracks were still there, now rusted and overgrown with ivy. The platform had been partially restored, turned into a historic site with plaques and tour guides, but that didn't matter. She knew exactly where she had stood that day. So did he. They stopped before the remnants of the platform. James looked down at his shoes, then at her. "I never thought I'd see you again." She looked at him carefully, her voice quiet, but steady. "I did." The past didn't rush back in a flood. It came in fragments, his hand on hers, the scent of his jacket, the sound of a distant train whistle that wasn't really there. And with it came the sorrow. Yes, but also the release. There was no blame, no bitterness. Only the deep exhale of two people who had lived entire lives in parallel. And now, by some grace neither of them could name, had met again. Not too late, but just in time to say, "I remember you, and you were worth remembering." It didn't happen out of ceremony, and it didn't require a plan. But from the day they found each other on that park bench beneath the late autumn trees, Evelyn and James began meeting every Thursday, always at the same time, always in the same spot. They did not speak of the past as something to be corrected, nor of the years lost as something to be reclaimed. They simply showed up, two quiet survivors of a war that had never officially ended between them, carrying pieces of a conversation interrupted decades before. Evelyn would bring a thermos of sweet tea or black coffee, depending on the weather, and often a small cloth bag tied with twine that contained copies of the letters she had written over the years, the ones that had been returned, unopened, and the ones she had never dared to send. James arrived with his own quiet ritual. A leather folder, the color faded from decades of being hidden, that contained the letters he had received, or rather, the ones that had somehow made their way to him through camps, aid workers, church offices, even strangers. They would sit together side by side as passers-by drifted by without knowing that two of the most extraordinary lives in Charleston were being lived in silence just a few feet away. They didn't read aloud, not at first. But one Thursday, Evelyn handed him a letter postmarked July the 2nd, 1963, the day President Kennedy visited Berlin, a day she had written to him about the noise of the televisions in the store windows, about the feeling of possibility that she had no one to share with. James took the letter in both hands, read it slowly, then reached into his folder and pulled out a note dated the very same day. A short letter he had written in a boarding house in Chicago after finally leaving the camps, one he had never sent, but in which he had tried to describe a dream he'd had about her walking along the Cooper River, wearing the same dress she wore the day he left. They looked at each other and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was undeniable. The same day, the same feeling. Two people, separated by oceans, connected by paper and longing. This happened often. They discovered these echoes across decades. Letters written in the same tone, on the same day of storms, on anniversaries neither of them spoke of aloud. She would describe a sunrise in one year, and he would unfold a note from that same date describing how he couldn't sleep and sat watching the sky. It was as if, through all the chaos and silence, something had still carried their words toward one another, even when they didn't know it. But they never spoke of regret. They didn't dwell on what could have been. They didn't talk about if only or what if. Instead, they filled the space between them with presence, showing up, listening, sharing stories not just of war, but of gardens, of books, of recipes they had forgotten until someone else remembered. Then, one Thursday in early December, Evelyn brought someone with her. Her granddaughter, Sarah, a journalism student at UNC Chapel Hill, who had stumbled upon the letters in her grandmother's attic while looking for a sweater during Thanksgiving weekend. Sarah, curious and gentle, had read the first few with reverence, and when she asked Evelyn what they meant, her grandmother had simply smiled and said, "They're a promise I kept." Sarah sat with them that day, notebook in hand, voice low, and asked if she could write their story. James hesitated. Evelyn looked at him, then nodded. "Let her," she said, "so someone remembers." Over the following weeks, Sarah became their witness. She recorded audio tapes of their conversations, not interviews, but moments. James talking about his first job after the war. Evelyn recalling the color of the curtains in her childhood bedroom. She photographed the letters, scanning them page by page. She asked Evelyn to read them aloud, and sometimes Evelyn did, her voice breaking and then continuing, like a record with scratches that still plays music. The project grew. Sarah wrote a manuscript, first just for them, then for her thesis, and then, eventually, for a publisher that specialized in historical memoirs. The book would be called I Wrote to You on Thursdays. It was not a story about war, not really. It was a story about what happens after war, about the people who kept loving after the bombs stopped falling, about how sometimes letters sent into the dark find their way back to the light. James and Evelyn kept meeting, even after the manuscript was done, even when their knees ached and their hands shook, because Thursdays were no longer about waiting, they were about witnessing, about showing each other that silence, when broken gently, could still become something sacred. And the letters, once symbols of distance, became something else entirely, proof not of absence but of presence, of endurance, of something lasting far beyond the moment when the ink first dried. Winter came softly that year, as if the city knew not to press too hard on those who were already letting go. The mornings in Charleston grew cold, the air sharp with quiet, and Evelyn could feel it, not in her bones exactly, but in the way the world seemed to slow around her, as if the hours were holding their breath. James didn't make it to their Thursday meeting in the second week of December. There was no message, no letter, no warning, only absence. And Evelyn, who had waited longer than anyone should ever have to wait, knew in her heart what silence meant this time. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, in a quiet room on the second floor of the boarding house where he had lived since returning. The nurse said he had a stack of letters beside him on the nightstand and an envelope in his hands. It was hers. Evelyn wrote her final letter the next morning, with tears falling gently onto the page, the words slower than usual, but just as steady. "Dear James, I think you knew. I think that's why you didn't say goodbye, because you knew I would write one more time, and here it is." At the funeral, she carried that letter in the same satchel she had carried for years, worn soft from decades of use. The service was small. Sarah was there, the local pastor, a few veterans from the community. There were no long speeches, only memories passed like candles between them. And when the moment came, Evelyn stepped forward and placed the letter inside the casket, right beside the wooden box that had started it all. "One more for the road," she whispered. The following spring, a small brass plaque appeared on the bench in the park, the one beneath the camellias where they had found each other again. It bore no grand declaration, just a single sentence. Here, between silence and memory, two people found their way back to one another. Sarah's book was published that summer. I Wrote to You on Thursdays became more than just a thesis. It became a story that lived in libraries, in classrooms, in the hearts of those who believed that it is never too late to keep a promise. Schools began assigning it to students. Veterans centers framed pages from it. Letters poured in from people who had lost someone, waited for someone, or simply needed to believe that love could outlast war. And Evelyn? She kept walking to the bench every so often, not always on Thursdays, not always with letters. Sometimes she just sat, let the sun touch her face, and listened to the quiet that wasn't so heavy anymore, because she had kept her promise. And because in the end, he had heard her, We share real stories like this every day, stories that inspire, comfort, and stay with you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you for being part of this one.